Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's SLSA++ survey webinar. I'm John Speed Myers. I'm a principal research scientist at Chainguard, and I have the honor today of moderating this panel on the recent SLSA++ survey and a broader discussion of software supply chain security. These four organizations that are represented here today partnered together on this survey on software supply chain security. And the structure of today's webinar is we're going to do quick introductions of each of the panelists. Then I'm going to do a quick overview of just the main highlights of the survey, the main findings. Then we'll switch to a panel discussion. We'll try to spend about 30 minutes or so with the panel discussion, and we're going to reserve a portion of the time for Q&A with all the audience. You can actually ask questions in the Q&A section. You'll see a small question mark. And we'll actually reserve, and you can vote there too on which questions you prefer to see asked. And we'll actually try to ask those questions of all the panelists at the end. So you will get a chance to ask questions. So please keep the chat going. So starting from left to right, we'll first have David Wheeler, introduce himself. So thanks so much, David, for coming today.
My pleasure. So I'm David A. Wheeler. I'm Director of Open Source Supply Chain Security at the Linux Foundation. And I've been working on how do you develop secure software and topics related to open source software for many years.
Great. Glad to have you. And then next we have Rebecca Rumble.
Thanks. Hi, everyone. I'm Becca Rumble. I'm the Executive Director and CEO of the Rust Foundation. We are stewards of the language and the trademark. And yeah, we are very, very invested in making the internet a secure place for everyone. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, great to have you. Finally, Mikhail, just a quick introduction of yourself and the Eclipse Foundation.
So I'm Mikhail Barbero. I work for the Eclipse Foundation. I'm head of security over there. The Eclipse Foundation is the largest foundation from the European Union. We are the host of more than 400 widely diverse projects, developer toolings, cloud native tools, IoT and edge projects, and software-defined vehicle. My job is to help our project improve the posture of the security posture of their supply chain.
Great, glad to have you. So the first thing we're going to do is just a quick overview of the main findings. So we'll see if this button works. It seems to, fortunately. And so I'm just going to discuss what this survey was and the top highlight findings. So our four organizations last summer and fall deployed a survey about software supply chain security, asking about 167 software professionals about the prevalence, helpfulness, and difficulty of 10 different software supply chain security practices. The majority, 7 of those, were derived from SLSA, this framework. It's an acronym for supply chain levels for software artifacts. Specifically, the questions came from version 0.1 of that framework, the version that was available at that time. And it's actually an interesting moment for the SLSA community in these questions, because SLSA 1.0 is slated to go live shortly in the coming weeks. So for each of these 10 practices, and we'll dive into the data a little bit, there were 3 questions asked. 1, how often do you do this practice? 2, in your opinion, how helpful is this practice for preventing, mitigating, or remediating software supply chain security compromises and attacks? And third, how difficult, in the respondent's opinion, is this particular practice? So that's the core of the survey. There were some free text responses too, and you can find all the survey findings and methodology in a PDF that was recently published a week ago. So just a few high-level findings. First, some software supply chain security practices are indeed widely practiced. There's a few that aren't, though. One that stands out in particular is that a centralized build service using something like GitHub Actions to do your builds is actually quite common. It really stands out. But there are others, for instance, always signing build artifacts, that are less practiced. For people who are SBOM aficionados too, you might be interested in the SBOM finding that only about 20% of the respondents said that they always use SBOMs. There's some variation there. Second, we asked about how helpful these practices are. And the thing that stands out to me is that there's surprisingly little variation among the perceived helpfulness of these practices. I think on a bright note, though, you could say that at least all of the practices, at least 50% of the respondents labeled the practices either extremely helpful or very helpful. So I think that points that there's an open door for these practices. I will point out, though, that the comments do provide texture to these quantitative answers. You can see more of them in the report, but I'll just point out one. For instance, some respondents, in trying to explain the relatively low rating of scanning container images during vulnerability scanning, mentioned high false positive rates. So you can find other tidbits like that in the report. And finally, I'll close with some of the findings related to the perceived difficulty of these practices. 2 practices were considered particularly hard, and by a long shot: hermetic builds and reproducible builds. They were considered, 50% of respondents considered those either extremely difficult or very difficult. I'll also mention, which was a surprise to me, that for each of the different practices, there was no correlation between the perceived difficulty and the prevalence. It's hard to know causality here. The survey wasn't designed for that. But it does appear that the difficulty isn't standing in the way of adoption. And I'll point out too, perhaps surprising for some of the persons that are in the know about SLSA, but this idea of provenance, of how the code was built and when and by whom, was considered the 3rd most difficult practice, which could just be a reflection of the newness of this as a concept and its tooling. So at this point, though, we're going to just dive into a session where I'll moderate and ask some questions of the panelists. Like I mentioned, feel free to ask questions in the Q&A, and we will certainly reserve a time to discuss those. And so with that, the first thing I'd like to ask the panelists, and this is the any panelist, were there any surprises or especially notable findings that stood out for you? Feel free to jump in.
I can jump in if that's okay. So firstly, I was really just excited that that you guys were actually taking this forward. So we were very happy to support it. I don't think generally the findings were that much of a shock to us. I think it really reflects where a lot of us are at the moment, which is wanting to do better and trying to get into these things, but not really having full confidence or not really being quite there yet. There's still a way to go. And I think this is encouraging, less surprising, more encouraging that the will is there. And, we were never going to get these things perfect immediately. So we've got good things and goodwill to build on.
Thanks, Beck.
Yeah,
Dave,
so I'll jump in real quick. I don't know if it, I think one thing that was a little surprising was the lack of correlation between difficulty and, whether or not it was being executed. And by the way, it's hard to interpret exactly why, but my interpretation right now is the same as yours, which is even though they're harder, they apparently aren't so hard that they impede adoption. I'm not sure I'm completely surprised, but I find it intriguing that the perceived helpfulness was somewhat similar. I think you can argue that one possible cause is, the different practices are good at countering different kinds of problems. But nevertheless, usually on these kinds of lists, you expect to see this is really helpful, this not, and it really was much more a matter of there's a whole lot of things and they're all perceived at least relatively helpful. And again, I think that's a good sign for adoption.
So
Thanks.
if I may add something that not really surprised me, but I find it interesting. So it's not about the the content of the survey per se, but about the demographics actually. So about now, the majority of the respondents are from Europe, and that's actually what we are experiencing on a daily basis at the foundation. Most of the Eclipse Foundation, most of our developers are from Europe. So I found it quite interesting that the supply chain concerns is also mainly concerning people in majority from Europe.
Yeah, thank you. That is interesting. Well, I have another question. This is again to all the panelists, and it's specifically about the SLSA framework, which we didn't dive into it much, but it's a software supply chain integrity framework. But from your perspective and the perspective of your organization, I was curious what you saw as the strengths and the limits too of SLSA and the associated practices.
So I will continue if I have the mic already. The main strength of SLSA for me is its pragmatism. It's really pragmatic, really developer oriented. So it speaks to the developers. It's very easy to let them to make them understand why it is important to follow those best practices. So when you compare to other frameworks for supply chain security, which are much more, let's say, verbose, SLSA is very pragmatic and very well written. So that's definitely its biggest strength. Regarding the limits, I would say that as a consequence, the scope is much thinner than other frameworks like the NIST SSDF and others. And it has actually been even more reduced with the recent 1.0 release candidate, or to be reviewed release of SLSA. But hopefully it will improve over time and the scope will become much larger, but retaining its pragmatism.
Thanks, Mikhail. David or Beck, if you're interested in saying anything. Well, I do have a question for David on this topic. As Mikhail mentioned, SLSA is he used the term thin, a relatively constrained, limited framework. And I know there are some other, you could call them, framework might be too strong a term, but implicit mental models of security that you find throughout other OpenSSF projects. I'm thinking of scorecards, for instance. I was curious when you'd recommend SLSA and when not, to whom, and how you would help a team that is serious about adopting one or more of these. How do they make an informed decision?
Well, let me first comment on that word thin. I would say the word focused. SLSA is very focused on not trying to solve all problems of the universe, but specific things. As it was noted, 1.0 is going to focus specifically on build, and the plan is to re-add some of the controls on source, again, because the focus is on being, pragmatic. We want things that actually help, but no more, and focused enough that it's not overwhelming. So as far as other things go, there's a vast number of other things I can point to. So if your question is, for example, how do I evaluate the software that I'm open source software or software in general before I bring it in as a dependency? The OpenSSF has a concise guide. You go to the OpenSSF website and look for the resources and then the guides. You'll find various things, including a concise guide for evaluating open source software. And it has a relatively short list and points off to other things, including scorecards and best practices badge, which are scorecards works to make an automated measure of certain practices. Best practices badge is more of a form of here are things that you would like to see open source software projects do and a rationale of what they're doing or not. And I can't help but to also mention S2C2F, hard name to remember, but that's in some ways it's a complementary effort that's been just gotten off the ground, trying to help people evaluate supply chain related issues for something they're thinking about bringing in. So those are at least several that that I would mention.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much, David. Well, another specific question, this one to Mikhail. I've heard you mention a SLSA badging program, perhaps underway at the Eclipse Foundation. I think the audience could be interested in what this is and the motivation and its current status too.
So the motivation first is to help our project communicate about their adoption of supply chain security best practices. So again, SLSA is a very good candidate. It's very pragmatic, very focused, as David said. So it's very easy for them to adopt and understand it. So that's why we selected SLSA as our main target, and we help our projects comply with the requirements, but we also let them communicate about it so that they can now select from their project metadata things that we have at the foundation, so that they can declare that they comply with some levels. So that's done already, and we already have a couple of projects we have declared their compliance level. So the most well-known project, for instance, is the Eclipse project. So it's a project that releases Java binaries. It builds OpenJDK and provides Java binaries for many platforms and many CPU architecture. It's currently more than 200 million downloads so far. So it's very, very widely used, and we are happy that they comply with SLSA. So they comply with SLSA level 2, as in version 0.2. We've planned to reach level 3 or 4 by the end of the year. They actually already comply with many requirements from level 4. For instance, they have reproducible builds of Java runtimes and stuff like that. So they are really advanced on that front. Upcoming works on that is we really want to help our project also describe how they complied with the SLSA requirements. So far we've had certain levels, 4 levels of compliance, but no way to really describe how a project complied with the requirements for each level. So we are defining a tool again to help our project communicate in a standard way how they complied with those requirements.
Okay, neat. Out of curiosity, have there been notable challenges or issues that projects, Teamrin or other projects, had to work through? Anything that stands out in your recollection?
So provenance attestation is definitely the hardest, especially because most of our projects still use our Jenkins CI farm. So we have 250 Jenkins instances running in-house. So there is no tooling so far available to generate provenance attestation. So that's the main showstopper for them to get to higher level of SLSA compliance. But we're working on that, and we'll get something out soon.
Cool.
Stay tuned.
Neat. Apologize, panel, so I'm going to skip around a little bit on our schedule, but I wanted to ask a question to Beck, a more general one. I think the audience could just be curious in general about the security-related initiatives underway at the Rust Foundation, and both its activities and grant making. And I was curious to hear more.
Thanks, John. Sure. So the Rust Foundation, we are a young foundation. We're pretty new compared to the veterans from Eclipse and Linux. We've only been around for a couple of years. So we are kind of, we're coming at the problems with slightly fresh eyes, maybe, and obviously from the perspective of the Rust programming language. We kind of came into existence kind of at the same time that people were getting a lot more kind of focused around security and starting to think more kind of structurally about it, rather than in a kind of bolt-on fashion that we might have done with security in the past. So we felt that one of the kind of key priorities in building the foundation and kind of developing our strategy for the next few years was to really kind of double down on security, not least because so many very prominent people in the space, but also very prominent people in policy making now around the world, are kind of, getting up on stages and saying, you should use Rust by default on these kinds of things or other memory safe languages, because these are security features that are going to help you. So yeah, we felt like we should kind of take the lead as a foundation to try and invest in security upstream. So we've been very lucky working with the Alpha Omega project and OpenSSF. They've given us a grant. Some of our partner organizations have also provided us funding to hire security engineers and also software engineers to develop really good tooling, really good features, automation, to try and kind of bake in security at this kind of very basic level. So yeah, we're just kicking that work off now. We're hopeful that we're providing updates on a monthly basis if anyone is interested. It's on the Alpha Omega GitHub. But so that's kind of a big prong of what we're trying to do. We're trying to make sure that Rust delivers on its promises. The last thing we want is a year from now everyone going, but we wrote it in Rust and you promised it would be secure and it hasn't been. That's going to be super embarrassing for me if we're in that position. So yeah, we want to make sure that we're scaling and we're securing as much as possible and as proactively as possible. Another part of that, as you said, is the grant making that we're doing ourselves, which is trying to kind of secure or maintain a pipeline. I'm sure everyone here knows the pain of the not enough warm bodies to maintain everything that needs to be maintained. We're trying to use relatively modest but relatively broad program of fellowships and grants to encourage people into that kind of maintain a pipeline, to give them the training and the opportunity and the mentorship and the kind of confidence with the teams to become active contributors and active maintainers into the future. So hopefully, that will create an ongoing flow of maintainers rather than putting everything on our heroic but potentially, frazzled maintainers for the future. So yeah, that's an area we're investing in that we hope we'll have specific security fellowships opening in a couple of months. So if anyone here is interested, watch this space and we'll be putting information out soon.
Cool, that's exciting. Thanks, Beck. At this point, I actually wanted to dive into a couple of practices that were both covered in the report. One of them outside the context of SLSA, one of them within SLSA, already alluded to by Mikhail. But I was curious, since you all represent foundations and the projects associated with them, do you encourage the projects associated with your foundation to produce SBOMs, software bill of materials, essentially an ingredient list of components? And I was curious why or why not. And so this is once again another open stage question. Feel free to say, well, that's the wrong question to ask, which is totally legitimate too.
So if you want, I can give it a stab. So first of all, yes, we are encouraging our project to generate SBOM, but I would like to roll back a little bit, and we are actually generating SBOM for projects for quite a long time already. So the Eclipse Foundation is well known for its IP processes and the legal framework that we have. We ensure that every release is IP clean regarding the licenses of our project. They are all compliant and so on. So we've been migrated to a lot of manual reviews and in-house tools to SBOM for license compliance verification. And so we've been doing that for already a couple of years, and now we are encouraging our project to actually generate the SBOM by themselves and to ship it along with their release for the added value of security that it brings, of course. And we do that because we think it's really helpful to build trust between the developers and the users of the projects, but also because we want our project to be as easy to integrate, even especially given the new regulations that are coming our ways. So government have started to notice that open source supply chain is a risk. in the industry. So we will be regulated at some point for the best or the worst. It's not yet defined, but at some point we want to help our projects be as easy as possible to be certified for those upcoming regulations. And we think that SBOM is really the way to do that.
Great, thanks, Mikhail. David or Beck, do you have perspectives from your own organization or more broadly?
Linux Foundation's big. We've got, for those of you who don't know, Linux Foundation's a foundation that creates foundations. So it's a little harder to give a broad answer. But I mean, certainly in a broad sense, we encourage generating SBOMs. Different organizations are in very, very different circumstances. I know, for example, that Zephyr produces really incredible detailed SBOMs, going into detail by file and tooling and so on. But there are so many different ecosystems, and the tooling and other decisions vary quite a bit. So in a broad sense, sure, but the details vary a lot depending on the specific project. And as I think, I think it helps to step back and realize that really until pretty recently, I mean, SBOMs aren't new. They've been talked about for a long time, but the idea of, hey, we really actually want them and we are going to use them as customers is relatively new. And this is going to be, I think, a long lift for the software industry to try to support SBOMs. In part because, frankly, SBOMs are really for the consumers. A developer doesn't, the only thing that they do things with SBOMs, perhaps, of things that come in, but they don't do anything themselves with the SBOMs they generate. It's for someone else. And so that's a different kind of, it doesn't mean it can't be done. It just means that this is a different kind of thing. And I think there's a speed of light limitation where if I'm going to generate an SBOM, I'm probably ingesting other things. I may need their SBOMs. Where are yours? And so there's this, request backwards up through the supply chain as you try to get your upstreams repeatedly to do the same thing.
Yeah, I'd say from our perspective at the Rust Foundation, we totally understand and support the importance of SBOMs in the software supply chain. But there's a lot of variation, like David said, and there's we have to respect the fact that some people don't want to work like that, and some people actually they're not even developing with people like downstream in mind, right? There's a lot of different motivations for people kind of developing in this space, and I think whilst absolutely, if you are developing with a mind to your projects integrating, absolutely SBOMs, it would be foolish not to. But let's not forget that, as with the history of open source, sometimes people are simply not thinking about what might happen in 3 years and what your project may end up being integrated into. You're tooling around out of your own interest. And the last thing you want to do is be kind of heavy-handed in your approach to encouraging people to do an awful lot of this extra work that an enthusiast rather than a professional simply doesn't want to or doesn't see the point in it. It might be the difference between that person getting very turned off or continuing with their interests. So there's a definite, it really depends, I think, from our point of view, on what your kind of goals are and making sure that you have scope to be able to develop those SBOMs, but that it's not a red line.
Yeah, that's really sensible. I think for me it begs a broader question, and I realize the question I'm going to pose is it can't be simply answered, but there seems to be a trade-off potentially between the freedom and autonomy often associated with open source software development, providing software as is, and potentially the the security needs or even privacy needs, depending on how you frame it, for users of that software. I was curious how, in your minds as representatives of different organizations, you think of balancing these goals. Are they trade-offs or not? How do you manage them as trade-offs if they are? If there are any takers for that question, I realize that's a big one to bite off.
I'm going to take a stab, but I'm trying to even parse your question and figure out what the question is. I don't think there's necessarily a trade-off in at least one sense. I don't know of any developer who wakes up and says, I'm writing software and I want to be terribly insecure. I mean, with the exception, I guess, of the people who write software that's designed to be insecure as test platforms. Okay, I'm going to, that's a different thing. Most software developers want to write software that's at least good enough for purpose. They don't wake up in the morning and saying, "Hey, I want to write another defect." But I think the challenge for a lot of developers is they don't, most cases, they've never been told how to develop secure software. A lot of the things that involve developing secure software are no harder, and in fact, many ways easier than doing it the insecure way. I love to look at prepared statements and so on, and so on for for handling SQL queries. And once you know how to do that, or doing input validation, once you know how to do that, it often tends to make the code easier to work with. But because they don't know, it's hard. Because it's not because they're stupid, it's because no one told them. Another challenge, frankly, is not always having the tools, and to some extent, there are efforts ongoing to try to make more tooling available, automate things. Trying to make things the default. I think that's very, very important. We need to do more of that. So I think there are ways to deal with that. So it's not necessarily a trade-off, at least in the usual sense of it. But that requires effort, which is, I work a lot with the Open Source Security Foundation, OpenSSF. Because that's kind of the remit, if you will, of OpenSSF, is to try to do things to improve the tooling, to do it. We have a free educational course on how to develop secure software, all those things, basically to try to make it so that instead of a grind and a horrible thing, it's, oh, this is no problem. That's what we're at least trying to move towards.
Yeah, thanks, David. I think from the last broad question, before we can move to Q&A from the audience, if there are questions, feel free to write them into that question mark box. And I heard this alluded to earlier, is, well, increasingly, because the security of software has become so critical, including the security of open source software, that governments have gotten interested. And there's broad discussion of what the government's role in a number of countries, but especially in Europe and the United States, because of recent proposed or legislation and executive efforts. And I was curious, from any of you who would like to answer, what you saw as the potential positive and potential downsides too of more government involvement, and that could be in a number of forms. Curious to see if anyone had thoughts they would like to share.
Oh, I have thoughts. Beck, why don't you go ahead?
I think everyone's got thoughts about where the government should jump in, right? I think, thanks for lobbing a grenade into things, John. Okay, well, I'm happy to kick off and see what everyone else says, because I'm sure there's going to be a few spicy views. I'm potentially a little bit controversially, I'm glad to see government waking up and getting involved, realizing the digital infrastructure is critical infrastructure, that it should require serious thought and attention and funding. I don't necessarily think that regulation is always a bad thing either. Maybe that's, you know, being European. I don't know, we do like regulation. But I think, you know, I think it does help people, it lights a fire under people to wake up and think, okay, should we be doing this? And I think it helps push forward innovation as well, because normally if governments start talking about regulation, it really prompts a lot of the private sector as well to start looking critically at their own practices and saying, right, okay, we need to come up with something that is good for the sector, good for us, good for innovation. Otherwise, we're going to be battling against poor regulation. So I think the principle of governments taking notice is a good thing. The problem with governments taking notice is that generally policymakers have a very, very low understanding of this sector. I have, you know, I think everyone on this panel has been talking to different policymakers and different governments over the last year or two, and there is a lack of understanding. I get words and phrases said to me that don't actually bear. They're not real. They don't bear any relationship with reality. You know, I as I said at the front of this seminar, you know, I have people saying, oh, Rust, well, yeah, just write everything in Rust, that'll be secure there. It's not as easy as you know, I'm having to manage expectations because people have kind of just lumped everything in together. People don't have a good understanding of memory safety. They don't have a good understanding of some of the things that we're really talking about. So there's a problem with a lack of understanding in government that is a risk, because if policy making is based on poor information, we're going to get poor policy and poor regulation. The other thing I'd say is that, you know, I think governments should be setting an example. Open source, you know, open source is contributing to this critical infrastructure. I don't see many governments providing funding to the open source space, or even collaborating meaningfully to leverage funds into the open source space. So I think there's a lot of work to do there. But generally, I encourage some attention from government, as long as they understand that, you know, they need to shape policy in partnership with the open source community, not without it or standing on the outside of it. I'll shut up now.
No, that's thanks, Beck. We really appreciate it. I saw David potentially scribbling notes, but Mikhail might have things to say too. Open to either of you.
I'll jump on, and Mikhail can tell all the things I didn't say. So, yeah. So I think I think it is appropriate for governments to be interested, because I completely agree with Beck that, you know, hey, digital infrastructure is infrastructure at this point. I mean, look what we're doing right now. But you know, there are potential downsides here too. You know, things like legislation and executive orders and that sort of thing can be both forces for good and forces for ill. Anything that the government any government imposes on should have the attributes you would expect for anything that's regulatory. Things like, it needs to be completely clear. I've heard somebody said, oh, hey, there's always an edge case. If almost all software is included in your edge case and we can't figure it out, it's not an edge case. Okay, if it's 1 in a million, that's an edge case. But I've seen too many proposals where no one knows what it means. That's very dangerous, and especially when you consider that a vast, I don't know what the numbers are. We're still, I know that some other folks are working on it, but basically something like half of the open source projects, it's basically one person part-time. Now there's many other projects where it's large, thousands of developers. So I can't say one size fits all, because there's many different kinds of open source projects. But if you're going to create regulations that people can't understand, they can't possibly do it. It needs to be beneficial. The pros need to be more than the cons. All things have pros and cons, but it needs to be very clear the pros are better than the cons. Pragmatic. Hey, this will be better. All you need is $1 million. I don't have $1 million. If you're imposing requirements on me personally, and I am a developer of open source software myself, I don't have that. I guess probably and more of a procedural thing is make sure you get involved, make sure you interact with the stakeholders, the knowledgeable people, coming back to Beck's point. Now, I will say that I've seen a lot of variation in knowledge within various governments. I absolutely have seen the case that you're talking about, Beck, where, I'm a policymaker, I can write policy, I don't know anything about software. But in another forum, I'm not sure I want to mention which government because this is not a government power play here. It's just, I went into one and, I'm talking to one of the staffers supporting them and, oh, you used to lead the Chrome security team. Oh, I don't have to explain what software is. This person could probably show up in any school and teach it. And so, having, either within your staff or work, and really, I would say both, make sure you get people both within your governments and interact with that broader industry is really, really vital. I think getting the stakeholders is important for any government press, be it regulation or anything else, to make sure that the unintended there's always going to be unintended consequences, but you want to make them the negative impact much smaller than the positive impacts. And if I could quickly wrap up, one of the big issues with a lot of open source software, and I guess I've already hinted at with the number of people, is resources. You're going to impose something that costs, as I said, $1 million or whatever, €1 million. If I'm a single developer, I can't do that. If I'm a foundation, turns out we don't have infinite resources either. And so I think it behooves governments to either make sure whatever they want is not too harsh, or that they find a way to work with us to find those resources. Because actually, most of us who develop open source software or software more generally, we want it to be secure. We want it to be good. But we have to be also pragmatic and work with the situation as it is. Developing software is hard. Just try writing an encyclopedia and never making a typo. And that's an example of what I give to people who aren't familiar with what software development is like. Why can't you stop making defects? You do the same, please. It's not that easy. And we have tools, we have processes, we have a lot of things that help us, but it's not as hard as one might think from the outside. It's not as easy as you might think from the outside. Thanks.
Yeah, no, thank you, David. That's really helpful. Mikhail, I don't mean to force this slot upon you, but if you do want to say something, there's a chance.
Yeah, though a lot have been said already, but yeah, we also support, of course, the fact that the ICT, especially the IT industry, has been the only industry unregulated for the last 50 years. So of course it will come, and we are happy about that. But specifically for open source, yeah, we are worried about the fact that open source software is misunderstood by policymakers most of the time, but open source is even more obscure to them. So we are really worried that they put too much burden, just like David was saying, that the burden of compliance would be put too early in the value chain, so on the developers or on the producer of open source software, rather than on people who actually monetized and use the software. So yeah, we need to educate policymakers. That's definitely something that we need to do.
Thanks, Mikhail. Well, I see that we've actually gotten to about the last 15 minutes of the talk, and we just got a question. So I'm going to ask that question, and it's open to everyone. And hopefully, if other people have questions, please feel free to submit them. And feel free to upvote too as questions come in. This question is, from Tad Taylor is from, how can we expect governments to develop regulations that work for single person projects to much larger projects? Think PuTTY versus Rust or Eclipse.
Oh, I'll take that, or at least I'll give a start, and then Beck and Mikhail can correct everything. Yeah, so I think the quick answer to that is it's not reasonable to expect governments to do that in isolation and all by themselves in some sort of ivory tower. You know, although it's not in any way a government, I think it'd be useful to contrast this for the OpenSSF Best Practices Badge project, which has a list of criteria. If you meet certain criteria, you get a badge. Although we did create the criteria, first we went out and did literature searches, got people who were experts, came up with drafts, and then we interacted with specific projects. So, for example, we specifically worked with curl, which is really, at this point, it's actually larger, but at the time we were interacting, it's really one person. And we worked with the Linux kernel project because that's a really big project. We worked with many different projects and sat down and talked with them and found out what their concerns were, compared what we had with what made sense. And I think that really comes back to, as I mentioned earlier, you need to get the stakeholders involved. Writing things in isolation or just, and throwing it over the transom and hoping for the best is probably not going to work. I think this is going to be, so I think it's possible. It is going to be a challenge. I think a lot of governments are used to writing some draft, legislation or policy. They post it somewhere, and of course the big company is going to show up and review and complain and lobby. No, the open source software developer, for the most part, they're going to keep writing code. They're not involved in this process normally at all, and so the normal let's write something and wait for lobbyists is really not going to work in this case. Governments are going to have to be much more proactive and find exemplars and interact with particulars to work. So I don't think this is an impossible thing. I think it's a good idea anyway to go out and talk to the folks that you're, that anything that involves a government might impact. But I think in this case, it's even more important.
Thanks, David. Beck or Mikhail, if you want to take it on.
Sure. I just quickly, I pretty much completely agree with what David said there. I think it's going to be very difficult for a government to regulate in a manner that is proportionate and reasonable for single person, very, very small projects. And I think that an awful lot of the burden should not fall on individual maintainers, whether you're talking about a slightly larger project or a single person project. I think an awful lot of the burden of regulation should fall on the people that are actually profiting from it. So we're talking, further downstream, we're talking about actors that have the funding and have the expertise and have the deep wallets to meet those regulations, whatever they are. Obviously, I'm very much in favor of good practice and good security hygiene. And, we're trying to encourage that at the Rust Foundation, but I'm very, very wary of anything that would suggest that individual maintainers or contributors to projects would be in any way accountable for substantial issues down the line, unless they were obviously deliberately sabotaging something. I really think that the burden of regulation should be on the people that can afford it and the people that are actually financially benefiting from open source.
Thanks, Beck.
If you don't mind, I just had one more thought. And so if you don't mind, I'm going to slip in one more because okay, thanks. So I'm just realizing that the U.S. National Cybersecurity Strategy, just recently released, has an interesting phrase that, it's a high-level strategy. What really matters is what you turn that into. But I very much like the phrase of focusing on very much, the phrasing is, where should the burdens be placed? And they ask that the more capable and best positioned be where the primary burden goes. Asking an individual part-time open source software developer to, hey, suddenly please do these things that will cost millions of dollars it doesn't make any sense any more than asking a small business to, hey, please bear the brunt of a foreign attack by a government, an attack by a foreign government. In all cases, the problem is the burden's in the wrong place. And so I think that's going to be a challenge to do in practice. I think that's going to be quite a challenge to figure out how to capture that. But, legislation and executive branches, that's the job, is to try to figure out where and how to clearly place that so it makes sense. So I think it's going to be hard. I wish them well. I think there's a lot of people who want to be helpful, but I think that's going to be the better direction.
Yeah, and if I may add something from the European side, so there are two regulations that are already submitted today on the European side for open source software security, or software supply chain security. Actually, this is the CRA, the Cyber Resilience Act, and the PLD, the Product Liability Directive. So it's a revised directive that adds software to it. We think they got it wrong regarding the open source software, and especially the framing, the balance between the putting the burden on the small ones versus the one who actually monetize or have a monetary benefit from open source. And we are actually lobbying for that. So far, those directives, they just exclude people or developers that are basically hobbyists. So the one who have no revenue at all from their development. But if you're employed by a company, if you get donations, if you receive donations, stuff like that, you would be in what European legislation say commercial activity. So you would have to comply with those new regulations coming. So it's a challenge to have governments write such a regulation right. We and other communities, so the OSI, the OpenSSF, the DLF, and various other companies in Europe are trying to lobby to have those wording change. But yeah, it's hard.
Yeah, thanks so much, Mikhail. Well, I just checked our Q&A and I don't actually see any more questions. We can give it, we only have 5 minutes left. One option is if any of the panelists have a last word they'd like to offer to the audience, this is a chance, and there's a chance for questions to come in, and after that, then we can close. So if there's anything you would like to say, I see David has his hand up.
I do. I can think of two quick things already. One is I just kind of wanted to riff on what Mikhail just said about the European CRA. I have reviewed it. The OpenSSF and Eclipse and many other folks have submitted comments about this. I guess my view right now is that it has some very serious challenges with lack of clarity, and the obvious way to read it puts a lot of burden on individuals who cannot possibly bear that burden. So while I think there's a way to do what the EU wants, that doesn't mean that the text as written is going to get them there. I think it's actually right now on a dangerous path. I think it can be fixed. It's just, it requires that. And there's all sorts of odd confusions. For example, in the US, under US law, open source offers commercial software. So saying, hey, open source, as long as it's not commercial, a lot of us in the US are going, huh? I mean, in the under a US law, at least US acquisitions law, if it's licensed to the general public and it has a use that's not in government, that's a commercial item. So if it's sold, leased, or licensed to the general public, it instantaneously becomes commercial. So the whole, hey, we're going to exclude the commercial open source, makes everybody else go, that's all of it. What are you talking? We only want the commercial open source software. Well, that's the same thing. So what are you talking about? So I'm hoping that more people will get involved and try to help legislations and executive, because I think they have the desire is good, but execution is what matters. I don't. In the end, it doesn't matter what the motivations are. What matters is good execution. Second thing, SLSA. We've mentioned very, very briefly that when this survey came out, we used the version that was available, which was entirely appropriate. But like many things, SLSA, like many specifications, in fact, I would say almost all successful specifications, SLSA originated from a particular company which was doing it. They wrote things down, and then it was contributed to OpenSSF, and many, many other organizations have been working to figure out, okay, that works for you, that doesn't work for anybody else, or you've acquired one particular way of doing things. You can get to the same end many other ways. And this is exactly the kind of thing that you want to have happen when you broaden something from one organization to something that can be used broadly in industry. So the deadline for comments on SLSA 1.0 is the 24th. So please, if you please take a look. From 0.1 to 1.0, we decided to focus for now on the build portion and the first 3 levels. There's a 4th level of the build, and there's some source requirements that are going to probably go into the next version of SLSA. But what was decided is, hey, let's focus on what we can agree on, put that down, then extend. So please do send in comments. Take a look, send in comments, because we want we want our supply chains to be well secured everywhere.
Thanks, David. Beck or Mikhail?
So very quickly, I first wanted to thank Chainguard, John and Chainguard, and also my co-panelists for this survey. It's been great to be involved in there and to raise awareness about SLSA. We really think that SLSA 1.0, the upcoming 1.0, is really great and really pragmatic way to improve the security of the supply chain of open source software. So please have a look, as David said, and put your comments before the deadline. So yeah, that's basically it.
Thanks, Mikhail. And Beck, any last words?
Just again to echo Mikhail, thank you very much for taking the lead on developing this survey. And I think there's definitely more research that we can maybe do in future to unpick some of the things that we couldn't quite conclude on this one. So yeah, I hope this is maybe the first of many bits of research we all get to collaborate on. And yeah, if you're interested in Rust or Rust security, check out our newsfeed and our GitHub page.
Thanks, Beck. Well, thank you all for attending today, this SLSA++ survey discussion and a broader discussion of software supply chain security. We've enjoyed it, and thank you for all the panelists. Thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedules to discuss this topic, and hope everyone has a good day. Thank you.